Every president likes to have some central nugget that they could focus on, some big idea if they can. And that's particularly important because it's always surrounded by a lot of little ideas.
This is At Brookings, a weekly in-depth look at issues behind the news. This week, the history of the State of the Union.
In one of the great traditions in American politics, the Commander-in-Chief since 1790 has delivered a State of the Union address. Over the centuries, the custom has grown from its origins as a direct message to Congress to a major presidential speech meant for the nation and the world. Senior Fellow Emeritus Stephen Hess examines the evolution of the State of the Union, saying many presidents have left their mark. Well, Stephen, what's the purpose of this big, grandiose speech?
Well, it's a message, and it's to everybody, Congress included. A lot of it, of course, has to do with proposed legislation. To that degree, it's what the president is asking of the Congress to do. It's what he's telling the American people he's going to do, and also what he plans to do in terms of his own branch of government. And, of course, the rest of the world, too. Everybody's looking over the president's shoulder around the world to see what he's proposing. And as often as possible, the president tries to divide it into two sections, one domestic and one international.
Over the centuries, so much about the State of the Union address has changed from how it's delivered to whom it's delivered, where it's delivered. Tell me a little bit more about those changes.
It became called the State of the Union, I think, by Franklin Roosevelt. Before there was a presidential speech, but he made it clear that from now on it would be called the State of the Union. And yeah, it started with the first president, and he went up, it was in New York, and gave the speech. And then Thomas Jefferson decided, no, I don't want to do it that way, it's too regal. And so he just sent it up, sent up two, one to the House, one to the Senate, a written document. And that's the way it remained through the 19th century. Woodrow Wilson decided he would go back and give it in person, and that's the way it's been done ever since. Eventually, it was on radio, then it was on television, then it was on internet, and so forth. But that happened over time, and so it got to be more and more a national speech, less and less, in a sense, a working speech for the government of the United States.
And what about the rebuttal? That's a relatively new change to the State of the Union tradition dating back to the mid-1960s. How did that come about that the opposing party would formally and publicly take issue with the contents of the president's speech?
Lyndon Johnson wanted the State of the Union to be on prime time. We're now into the television age, and it made a difference to him, and that made it a very valuable piece of property politically. So the next year, that was 65, the next year, 66, the Republicans controlled, with the opposition, Johnson being a Democrat, the Republicans wanted a response. And at that point, the nature of the speech basically changed. Where it had been up to that time a president talking to the people, it was now a leader of a political party talking to people, followed by his opponents, the opposition, also talking to the people. It was unconstitutional in my judgment. It was non-constitutional. It was outside the framework of what the Constitution had been set up to, because the Constitution, the Founding Fathers, were really very much against political parties, factions as they call them.
Well, Stephen, from time to time, the State of the Union address is used by presidents to sell something that is a little bit outside of the scope of the overall message. For instance, Abraham Lincoln used it to talk about ending slavery. James Monroe used his address to talk about the Monroe Doctrine. How did this come about?
Every president tries, if he can, for something that adds some color, some pizzazz, some interest. Franklin Roosevelt, in his speech, was it 41, talked about the four freedoms: the freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, and the freedom of want, and the freedom of fear. And so there were very, very moving moments as we were going into World War II, coming out of a Great Depression, going into World War II, and he used it in that way. But the number of great policies that you could say, that one started in the State of the Union, are relatively limited. I should say, by the way, Harry Truman proposed national health insurance. That was a long time ago, 1948.
Another way that the State of the Union address has changed is highlighting somebody who's sitting in the box with the First Lady. How did that come about? That began with Ronald Reagan, I do believe.
It had been a movement in 1981 where there was a plane crash. Air Florida plane crashed in a storm into the 14th Street Bridge in Washington. A young man on his way to, a government worker on his way to work, I think his name was Lenny Skolnick, jumped in to rescue people. The president invited him for the speech to sit there in the gallery and then introduced him. Since then, every president has picked some people, and they're often picked to illustrate something.
There's always one person who isn't there just in case.
There is always one cabinet officer who is kept away. If everything is blown away, we've got one cabinet officer who's formally in the line of succession. By the way, I believe now, in these tough times, that the Congress does the same thing, and one or two members of Congress will also stay away for the same protective reasons.
Now, of course, there have been short speeches. I think President Washington did a speech that was just a little bit more than 1,000 words. And there have been long speeches. You yourself, Stephen, are a former White House speech writer. What makes a really good speech?
Bill Clinton gave a speech, I don't know, 89 minutes or something. Why was it an 89-minute speech? Well, two reasons. One, he loved to talk for 89 minutes. But the second reason is it might have been a 30-minute speech. By the time people stopped applauding, it was a 90-minute speech. Why are they applauding? Because, of course, every time they applaud, the camera shoots on them in the hall. So this is a grand opportunity for all of these legislators to think that they could get 15 seconds of national publicity. They have chosen to make it into a show, which clearly wasn't the case either for George Washington or then for the rest of the 19th century when they weren't speeches as such, but were documents presented to the Congress.
Stay up to date with the latest research, learn about Brookings events, and search our directory of experts, all from your mobile device. To download Brookings for your BlackBerry, Android, or iPhone, go to brookings.edu/mobile.